much, Alex, and thank you, Rana, for the invite to this great event. It's been really good, and I've learned a lot about different contexts. I think I'm going to end up consolidating a lot of what's been said already today and maybe repeating some of it. And I think that's actually a good thing, because what it means is that we're all pretty much on the same page in terms of where the barriers are and what we need to do. I'll start my presentation and hopefully so hopefully you can see my slides. And yeah, so I'm going to give a presentation on industrial symbiosis in the United Kingdom context. There we go. Right, sorry. So yes, as has been mentioned several times today, the industrial symbiosis is a component of circular economy, and it's important to differentiate the two, because ultimately we do need to get to a broader and more circular economy, because we have to get to the point where we reduce our resource use rather than simply recycle or reuse all these materials that we're extracting from the earth. And industrial symbiosis, as the slide says, it's an element of that transition towards that sustainable circular economy. And we need it because, as we can see from the left image, that around 50% of climate emissions come directly from that resource extraction. And something that hasn't been quite as mentioned as much today is that also it's responsible for about 90% of biodiversity loss, which is critical to the broader ecosystem and the well-being of the planet, making sure we maintain biodiversity. And from the images on the right, the other reason we need to get towards that reduce and see recycling and reuse as an element on the transition is that the more we recycle, the more we reuse materials, and the more we reduce, that actually we create more room for everyone and everything, and hopefully a happier and more healthy biosphere and ecosystem for all of us to prosper in. So in terms of industrial symbiosis, where does it come from in the United Kingdom? Well, we did have a national industrial symbiosis program, and it was a funded facilitation program, and that was important for a reason that I'll cover in the next slide. But it was developed by a gentleman called Peter Laybourne of International Synergies, and he was working for the Business Council for Sustainable Development in the Gulf region of Mexico, where he came across a very similar program run by several of the petrochemical companies and other big industries, where they actually paid a subscription fee to have people help them manage their wastes and deal with their environmental problems. And he saw this and he thought, well, that's got really good opportunities for having a big impact in the United Kingdom, but he knew it wouldn't work in the funded on a funded level. So he sought to acquire funding to try to develop this program, try to embed industrial symbiosis in the United Kingdom. And he managed to acquire funding from a couple of charitable organisations to run a pilot program in Scotland, the West Midlands and the Yorkshire and Humber regions. And this was back in 2023, 20 years ago now. And it proved to be extremely successful. So much so that the government actually put up some direct funding, which largely came from what we had at the time and still have now as the landfill tax. And in 2005, the programme was extended to all 9 regions, and then eventually to Wales and Northern Ireland, making it a truly national industrial symbiosis programme. And from, as far as I'm aware, still the only case of a fully national programme that has been operated on a national scale throughout the world. And right up front on day one, there was a conscious decision to seek out and work with the willing. And that's because there's a lot of inertia when it comes to industrial symbiosis. People don't like change. And just by simply working with people who are like-minded, automatically you're on a positive front, and you're able to make a collective movement towards creating that motivation for others to work with you. But there was also a collective decision straight away to go with national coordination. And what that means is that centrally, we collected all the data that we collected from companies and opportunities for developing synergies and for implementing them. But we were very conscious that it had to be delivered locally by people with local knowledge of the context of which they were working in. These were usually people who had worked many years in these areas. They had lots of contacts. They knew who to talk to about getting in touch with various companies, government organisations, environmental protection agencies, etc. And there was a very strong emphasis on day one about measuring impact. And there was several reasons for that, but two of the main ones were first, because this was new and the government were putting a lot of public money into it. Obviously, we had to justify that, so that we had a lot of key performance indicators that we had to meet. And secondly, it's because it goes back to that first point of working with the willing. The more of the evidence base we could create, the more of the willing we could in turn create and happy to work with us. And that point as to why facilitation had to be free in the United Kingdom initially was because most businesses are naturally risk averse and they avoid change. And industrial symbiosis, by definition, it's innovation, it involves change. And as we can see from this risk matrix, when you're working towards the right-hand side and you're talking about changing your operational focus on any sort of considerable scale, it's difficult and it's risky, particularly within a new market, and very much so in a new market, in a new sector. And as we can see just from some of the things highlighted, we can actually see that what those risks are, or perceived to be at least. And interestingly, a lot of people have mentioned these very things around trust, albeit myself, my research partner who is on this call will say, what do you mean by trust? Trust comes in many forms, and it's something you really need to get to the bottom of. There's also things about legal obligations. If you're potentially going to work in a sector or with a resource you've never worked with before, are you going to be fully aware of all the legal requirements around using that material? There's elements of secrecy. It goes to that point about working across silos, potentially creating a dependency on a resource you're not fully aware of its availability in the long term. And there's also issues, again, around knowledge about what you know about a given market, about a given material, that links back into that issue around skills and trust. But by having a fully funded facilitator, effectively a third party with nothing in the process other than supporting two or more organizations and doing something a little bit better, you change the market dynamic, as it were, and the engagement dynamic. You are effectively acting as the embodiment of trust, and acting as that gatekeeper and helping them come together. So that was why funding was needed, so we could create that image of complete neutrality between the organizations. And what were the headline results? Well, like I said, we were extremely successful. And just for England, between 2005 and it says 2013, but it's towards the end of 2012, just by bringing people, as you'll see in the top right image, around the table and getting them there and speaking about their shared problems and their shared resource haves and their resource wants and thinking about problems together in a collaborative format, we came up with these many solutions. We then went out and actually found other people potentially who could engage in these solutions once we had the broader data from the group working. And it led to all of these results you can see on the left. I won't go through all of them, but one of the key ones is obviously the greenhouse gas emissions, largely in that scope 3 that we've spoke about as being very difficult to manage, and over 40 million tonnes of savings. Massive reduction in virgin material use and industrial water use. Very key one there, that we created almost £2 billion in new sales and cost savings for UK PLC and all the companies within our programme. Now that equates to about $2.5 billion in dollars. And we created or safeguarded over 10,000 jobs. And you have to remember these are in-year savings. We are only allowed to measure savings in the 1 year we facilitated them and reported them. So there's persistence element here, which varies between 0 and 20%. So these savings carried on and continue to carry on in some cases for many years. And just as you can see from the text in bold, the modelling we've done and worked with other third parties shows that industrial symbiosis, when it's done on a proactive basis in a regional area, can deliver a return on investment of 10 to 40. I'm not sure about the Emirates, but in the UK, anything above 4 is seen as very high return on investment. So 10 to 40 is incredible, and it shows you the real benefits. And this is all evidence from the industrial symbiosis programme. The synergies, implementing synergies and circularity really works, can really deliver those economic, social, and environmental benefits. The other thing we generated, which I used to say and still say is possibly the biggest benefit and output of our program, was data. Lots of data relating to over 13,000 members and several thousand synergies. I think the last data I used was for 2,000 synergies, and that covers all different materials. And why that information is useful is because it covers, like say, so many different organizations, multinationals ranging from Conoco, Ford, IKEA, even Shell were a member in the UK area. through to you small companies, your large companies, community initiatives, everybody. And it's important to say that our practitioners were not limited in any ways to where they had to look for a potential user of a resource. So as you can see from the map on the right, this is basically links between the organizations that did facilitate synergy and the flow of that material. You can clearly see quite a few of them move many miles. However, if we could zoom into the map, we'll see that actually there's a lot of hotspots, and materials in general actually don't move that far. And this, we saw it as we developed this data and started collecting it and analysing it, was an opportunity to be more proactive in how we do industrial symbiosis. So our previous model was, the model that we relied on was a reactive demand-led workshop type system. So we bring people in, what are their issues, what are their demands, and how can we work with them. We saw all this data as a way to be more, to implement more intelligence-based thinking and be more proactive and create symbiosis. And the first thing we looked at was one of those key tenets of industrial symbiosis alongside the trust. The other one is geographic proximity. And yes, we heard from Collenborg in symbiosis earlier, and they talk about what the great benefits are of being close to each other. Well, we saw that as well. And as you can see from perhaps the chart on the left, that 50% of all our synergies were facilitated within 30 kilometers or 20 miles, which isn't that far, actually, if you think about it, because, like I said, our practitioners were not restricted by where they could look for a recipient of a material. They could literally look anywhere. And indeed, in Wales and Scotland, they were encouraged to look further away because they didn't have some of the facilities that the rest of us had in the English regions. But still, our practitioners could still find a synergy and facilitate it within a very short distance. And as you can see, even if you go up to 75% of the synergies, we're still moving only 50 kilometers in terms of creating that synergy. And if you want to break it down to individual resources, if you look to the box plots on the right, you can see that, yes, some of the more, shall we say, intricate or specialist materials like inorganic chemicals, some textiles, aqueous sludges, they did need to move a little bit further, which makes sense because if you start thinking about ecology, which industrial symbiosis fits within the industrial ecology way of thinking, things that are rarer by definition are usually specialists, and they take specialists to reuse those things or use them within that ecosystem. So it's understandable that they move that a bit further, but it's not that much. So when we saw those hotspots, as it were, where materials were moving, we saw an opportunity to, like I said, be a bit more proactive. So we took one of these hotspots and we tried characterizing it. And the one we worked with initially was the South Bank, which it was particularly predisposed towards power and heat sharing because it's a big industrial area. And there was lots of synergies in the region, everything from using putting CO2 into greenhouses to help the growth of tomatoes, and also pumping in excess heat from the sugar producer next door, through to innovative recovery of high value chemicals from animal wastes, through to using very simplistic things like rubber waste from a tire manufacturer in toy production. So it was really strong area for industrial symbiosis. So we characterized every element of it, from the diversity of the industry, the density of the industry, the road network, rail network, availability of water. And the idea was, if we can characterize it, put it through a geographical information system and generate a full map of the United Kingdom doing this, we'd be able to pick out hotspots. And that was effectively what we did. So we took those variables that we saw as characteristic of the South Bank, mapped them for the whole of England, and as you can see from the equation, it's a very basic one. It's a balanced equation. It basically means that where your observed characteristics are as close, are the same as, or very similar to your desired characteristics for a given area, then you'll find a hotspot of industrial symbiosis suitability, and the map on the right identified those areas for us. In some respects, it made sense, and we could have picked these out just by coming together in a room and really thinking about it. One of the noble things is that these are all port areas and coastal areas, which naturally lend themselves to industrial symbiosis, as you will have seen from Collenborg, Kwinana in Australia, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and the Gulf of Mexico, no less. They seem to be really good areas for industrial symbiosis opportunities. So we move forward and we produce these maps that allow us to strategically send out practitioners and be a bit more proactive, apply that intelligence-based mapping, and basically help local regions, local industries find these opportunities that they maybe didn't know actually existed. But the problem with this is that the method is restricted by data availability and its accuracy, as was mentioned quite a lot in the last panel session. So we had to think a bit further, and like I said, as you might have heard in my when Alex gave my biography, my background is, as well as being an engineer, I'm also an ecologist. So one thing I noticed within industrial ecology and industrial symbiosis, although we feed a lot on the ecosystem analogy or metaphor, not many people actually apply true ecology. And if you look into it, there's various aspects of diversity and the principles around diversity that are particularly useful in terms of understanding how industrial symbiosis can be facilitated and how it creates opportunities. So actually, I decided to just map the whole industrial diversity of England using the manufacturers, different types of manufacturers, as the variable within that. And as you can see, it picks out the dark blue areas are the high areas of highest industrial diversity. And then on the right-hand side map, I then just plotted all our synergies that moved within that typical resource movement distance. And actually, it transpired that 76% of all of our synergies were facilitated within the top 10% of highest contiguous diversity industrial areas. So that's a bit of a convoluted statement, but what it means is in areas of really high contiguous industrial diversity, 76% of our synergies were facilitated. And we found categorically that different types of industries in a given area create that opportunity for industrial symbiosis. And it does lead to opportunities for replication as well. So if we jump forward to the present, all those little things that we did in terms of learning about what we could do with industrial symbiosis and making it more proactive and making best use of all that data. Up to 2021, International Synergies, the founders of NISP, have successfully applied their facilitation experience in more than 40 countries and 6 continents. However, the NISP itself was actually ended back in 2012. And that's, in some ways, this was seen as a positive thing initially because the government had started dictating which industries we could work with and which resources for various funding reasons. And this is the opposite of how symbiosis works. It effectively cuts down that diversity, which is critical. Given that how well we were doing and the amount of money we were generating for UK PLC, the government effectively said that it should be a paid format and government should pay for the service. Unfortunately, that again goes against that key element of trust and that third-party facilitation that we found that was critical. And as it happens, we did a study only a month ago into industrial symbiosis in the Humber region again, which was so good all those years ago. And we found that the knowledge of synergies and symbiosis was actually very limited, and the development of resource efficiency had stalled massively. There was some big companies looking after themselves. They just get on with things regardless. They've got the resources, but in general, it had slowed down, particularly within smaller companies. It was almost non-existent. And even those with 250 to 1,000 members, what we would call a large company here in the UK, even they were struggling. And if we, based on an extensive stakeholder engagement and a huge meta-analysis of literature that my research partner did, we found that over the last 20 years, the barriers were still exactly the same. And it's basically that level of collaboration. How do you bring people together? If you don't know what your neighbour does, how would you potentially know whether there's an opportunity next door or whether they can solve a problem for you? So it was still how do you bring people together to collaborate and break that element of particular secrecy, working in silos. The other big issue was a knowledge deficit, which was wrapped up in terms of having the funding to basically commit somebody to be able to look for opportunities or to find where their problems are. So it was the same problems we'd seen years ago, and it all come through in the finding that the support of a credible third-party funded resource facilitator was still categorically the best way of facilitating industrial symbiosis. However, it's not all bad news. There are some new opportunities that have appeared in the here and now. And one of those, within this Yorkshire Circular Lab, what we did see was that really small organisations, particularly local community initiatives, where they had the strong motivation to do things in select areas. So we can see from the legend on the right, when you look at different, just particular resources, there were people in small community groups had a really strong interest in making sure that there was food sustainability or textile sustainability. And they had basically moved forward and just developed circularity programs themselves. And just by mapping all of these programs within the Yorkshire and Humber, we found almost 800 just within a few weeks of looking. And by mapping them, we thought we could create visibility for these organizations, potentially generate collaboration, and hopefully create replication, which would lead to hopefully bring out symbiosis and circularity more and more across the region, which this is a great opportunity. It shows that at the right level with the right motivation, perhaps you don't need this level of facilitation. The second opportunity, yes, those obstacles still exist, particularly around secrecy of material use and waste, and particularly around working in silos. But one of the big issues that doesn't always get recognised or mentioned is that waste there is almost, it's out of date almost as soon as it's produced. However, somebody made a very pertinent comment in a similar event to this a few years ago, and they mentioned that when it comes to energy infrastructure and similar things, we actually know what's out there in most cases and when it needs to come back. So you've got things like wind turbines out there, solar panels, oil rigs, other things, other electric vehicles, many things connected to the low carbon transition. They're full of some nasty materials, some composites that are hard to recycle. They're full of a lot of precious materials like copper, silver, and rare earth elements that are critical to the low carbon transition. We should know more or less where they are and when they're coming back. So there's potential there to build these business models that are needed to make these synergies work and this circularity work. And in terms of the future, I'll just finish on a couple of quick slides. Yes, we have those new opportunities, but in terms of how we can make industrial symbiosis happen in the likes of the Emirates or elsewhere, I think there's a few lessons that have actually come through repeatedly today, and that we learned from this and the Yorkshire Circular Lab experience. And the first one is, again, like I said, it was mentioned several times, you really do need that change in mindset, and you need to see all operational outputs as a valued resource. What we used to say in this was that all waste is actually a resource in the wrong place. It sounds simplistic, but actually it's hard to do, to genuinely see that thing that you've always put in the waste bin or sent to disposal or incineration as a resource potentially with a value. The second recommendation would be to seek and embrace diversity in literally all its forms. By that, I mean in the diversity in people, diversity in organizations, businesses and industries, because that's where the real opportunities are. You never know where the solution to your innovation problem could be. It could literally be next door. And again, work with the willing, because you need to create that collective evidence and that momentum to work against the inertia that exists and as opposed to the change that we need. Within an ecosystem, a biological ecosystem, change only happens when there is a sufficient environmental force within there. And we all currently have that. It's climate change, basically. That is the environmental force. It's biodiversity, degradation that's happening rapidly. The forces are there now, and we need to make that change. I will finish on one quick caveat, though, and that is that I go back to a symposium again similar to this back in 2008, where there was a gentleman from the Colombo Symbiosis called Jorgen Christensen. And we'd spent an hour all talking about our great inventions and how great we were and what brilliant jobs we were doing and these fancy new technical platforms. And he stood up very frustratingly and said, there is no black box solution to industrial symbiosis or making it happen quicker. And he basically emphasized that it's about people. People make industrial symbiosis happen and make circularity happen. And I would basically encourage everybody on this call, whether you be a government official or a business person, to invest in people, invest in your employees. And basically together we can all move towards this greater circular economy that we all like to see. That is not to say, however, that you do not need the platforms such as NISP created with their Synergy platform or Surplus, because they are the tools that will bring those people together. And I will finish there and I'll say shukran, thank you. I appreciate the time you've afforded me.